Hello and welcome to week 3 of the Big Girl School, Learn to Use Your Big Girl Camera. This week we are talking about shutter speed. This is the third and final piece of the exposure triangle, and after this week you should have a really good understanding and feel for how your camera works. And now all you have to do is get out there and practice, share your work, get feedback, and practice some more. It's the only way you'll get better. And I will never continue to say that over and over and over again, or I will continue to say that over and over again. The only way this is all going to sink in is if you practice. If you finish this week and go throw your camera in the closet, it's all going to go poof and go away. But I guess the good news is that you have this for a lifetime, so you can always come back and rewatch it. All right, but let's talk about shutter speed. I find, so let me just be honest with you, I find that my students in the past have had more difficulty understanding shutter speed. It isn't quite as straightforward. And I think I've figured out why. And here's why. Because we talk about blur, the good blur, so background blur, motion blur, intentional motion blur. There's different ways to use blur in a good way in photography. But then we start talking about bad blur, blurry photos, handshake, unintentional blur, unintentional motion blur. It gets very confusing, so just bear with me and I'll try really hard to explain it as simply as I can. And I'm also going to write some additional blog posts on this because I want it to be really clear exactly what I'm talking about. But let's first start with what is shutter speed. So the shutter is called a curtain, okay? And it's called a curtain for a reason, because it acts just like a curtain. So I want you to picture a sunny window in your home and it has a curtain on it, very simply, okay? So here's the window and here's the curtain. Now the light comes through the window, right? And so if you close the curtain and you keep it closed for a long time, and you open it and you keep it open for a long time, that's letting light in and out of the room, right? So your camera acts the same way. Your shutter is letting light in and out of your camera onto the sensor to make the picture. So if there's a lot of light, remember we talked about the apertures letting a lot of light in, the shutter has to be very fast. Otherwise, all that light's gonna rush in and it's gonna erase everything on there and you're gonna just get a white nothingness. It's going to be completely blown out. So the shutter has to be very fast so the light comes in, draws the picture, but not too much. So think light is your pen. My hand is the picture. Right now there's nothing on it, okay? So the shutter opens, the pen comes in, it draws the picture, comes out, the shutter closes, all right? Now picture it's nighttime in your bedroom in this window, and you want to let light into the room. You've got to leave that curtain open longer to let that light come in from the moon or wherever. It's got to be open for a while, it's got to flow in, and you've got to keep that open. So think of making a picture at night. So you open the shutter, the light's coming in, but it's very dark, so you have to leave it open longer so it can draw the picture, and any movement is going to cause that light to shake and be blurry. All right, so we're going to talk more about this. But when you think of the shutter, think of a curtain in your bedroom letting in light and keeping out light. That's all it is, nothing more technical than that. All right, so let's talk about slower shutter speeds. If we go back to my little train example here, you can see that this is very blurry. So a slow shutter speed lets in light, and if there's any motion, it will blur it. Additionally, at night, like we just talked about, picture Halloween. You've got all those pumpkins with the candles and the lights and all the eerie, spooky lights. In order for that all to flow into your camera and burn a picture, you have to leave your shutter open longer. Because if you go, toot, toot, there's not enough time for that light to get in there because it's so dark, all right? So a slow shutter also lets in more light. Now, faster shutter speeds produce sharp pictures, so you always associate, I think this is a little bit easier to understand. You associate this with sports. So Sports Illustrated photographer taking NFL football pictures on a bright sunny afternoon. Have you ever heard, like on TV, you hear the shutter just going, firing. You'll hear it in golf a lot because golf is so quiet. It'll be very quiet, and then as soon as he makes contact with the ball, you'll hear the shutters going, because those cameras take like 10 pictures per second or even more. So that's the sound that you're hearing. It's the shutter. And it does not let light in. So the light has to come in very quickly, and then it closes. So I hope that makes sense. So let's talk about water. And this is something you can do at home. A slow shutter speed produces like a milky flowing water. It's like whoosh. A fast shutter speed will freeze the water. So if you've ever seen a picture of a swimmer and there's like little drops, frozen, 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 that's a fast shutter speed and you're freezing the action. So there's different creative uses for slow shutter speeds and fast shutter speeds. You can use both any way that you want. So let's take a look at this picture. I had a little mini tripod. I was on a train in Europe, and I put my camera on the little mini tripod and I put it on my tray table. I then put it on shutter priority, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and I turned my shutter speed way down, so it was very slow. And then I put it on self timer and I let it go. So if you can see on the bottom left of the picture down here, you can see that the little vent and everything is all in focus, but this looks like scenery rushing by. So it gives, this motion blur gives the feel of the scenery rushing by. You can feel the movement. So I've used the shutter speed to create motion. Now let's go to the next picture. This is the same tripod on the same table, the same scenery, but I've used a fast shutter speed, and you can see it gives me an entirely different look, and I would say not quite so interesting. So here it feels like you're moving. Here it just looks like an ugly snapshot of some trees next to the side of the road. But you can see that the actual train window itself, oops, did not change. Watch that. So what a difference changing the shutter speed makes to create that feeling of motion. So let's jump ahead to another picture. Here's a swimmer. We're using shutter speed in an entirely different way. Here, we want to use a very fast shutter speed so that we're freezing each of the little drops of water all around his face, coming off of his cap, around his shoulders. Okay, so we want to freeze the action, and that is what a high shutter speed will do. Now, let's look at it both ways. So on the left, we have a waterfall, and you can see that I have made a very long shutter, so 1/3 of a second, which doesn't sound long, but it actually is in camera land. So that water's flowing. So if you think of water, 1/1000. So the water's traveled a good bit in that length of time, so 1/1000. So we're actually letting the water run during a portion of that second, and that's what gives it that milky flowing look. And so that's the way we create this feeling of a waterfall, of it moving over versus it just stopping and freezing. Now on the other side, we've got a football game here, and you can see that I'm using a higher shutter speed, 1/500th of a second, which is actually not as fast as you really want to use it, but it was in a dark stadium. It was on a Friday night, and the lights weren't that good, so I've only got it to 1/500th of a second. But you can see I've frozen the action. I've frozen the ball, their hands, their feet. So we want to do that to capture kind of the peak action in sports. Now, if you guys remember last week, we looked at this very same picture. Now, shutter speed does the same thing as aperture. It's another way to let in more light or take away light. So let's go back and review last week. All right, we're now back to aperture. Remember, the hole gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. It's letting in less and less and less light. Now, shutter speed, it's doing the same thing. As the shutter gets faster, so this fraction gets bigger, so 1/1000th is very, very fast. My camera will go to 1/8000th of a second, which is crazy. A lot of the entry-level cameras will go to 1/4000th of a second, which is still crazy. In this example, I've only gone to 1/1000th, but you can see I've not changed the aperture. In this last time, I kept the shutter speed the same. This time, I've kept the aperture the same, so it's f/5.6. The hole is staying the same in every single picture. I'm only changing the shutter speed. And you can see in the first example on the left, it's too fast. It's not letting in enough light. So the barn is completely dark, okay? And then as we move right, it's letting in a little bit more light, but the barn is still underexposed. I go to the right, still letting in a little bit more light because the shutter is getting slower, but you can see the sky looks good, but the barn is still dark. I move over to 1:320. It's getting better. The sky's getting a little brighter. The barn's getting a little brighter, but we're still losing details in those shadows. So let's move once again right to the middle. And here, I think in the middle, 5/6, 1/250th, ISO 100. That's probably your best exposure. You're losing a little bit of the sky because it's brighter, but you can see the barn, you can see the details in the shadows, you can see the grass, you can see the details of the bark and the roof. So that's probably our best exposure. Now, as we continue to slow down our shutter, so the fraction's getting smaller, 1/125, 1/80th of a second, 1/60th of a second, 1/40th of a second, we're starting to get a slower shutter speed, which is letting in more light, and then all the way on the right side, we're getting an overexposed photo. And what that means, remember the term, we've blown the highlights. We're losing detail in the brightest parts of the photo. So if we were to print that, the really bright white spots would be white. There would be no ink on the paper. Opposed to that, on the left side, where it's very black, if we printed it, it would be solid black. There would be no detail. So we're always looking for that balance of not too bright, not too dark, and that's what you see right in the middle. So not only does aperture let in and let out more light, so does shutter speed. Hope that makes sense. Now let's talk about kind of what a slow shutter speed does and what a fast shutter speed does. And I've used these train pictures. So I was actually on the train and I was just in shutter priority. So I would just change the shutter, take the picture, change the shutter, take the picture. And so the pictures are all different because obviously I was traveling through the countryside. But you can see the difference that adding a little motion makes. In this case, I think it looks a lot better. You can tell I'm on a train and that I'm moving. On the other side, it looks just like I'm taking a picture of a tree from a train. Kind of boring, and it's kind of dark too because I didn't change anything other than the shutter. I didn't increase the ISO, so I was starting to get a darker picture as I took the shutter faster and faster and faster to freeze the motion. So let's compare and contrast. On the slow shutter speed, it's gonna let in more light because remember the curtain's open longer, so the light's gonna flow in. You're gonna get motion blur. So anything that's moving while the shutter's open is going to blur. That's why you use such a fast shutter speed for sports because it's not open long enough to let anything blur. And then you're gonna use it a lot in low light photography because you've gotta let in light and it comes in slower because it's dark. All right, so you've got to let it in, let it draw the picture, and then close the shutter. All right, now let's look on the other side. On the fast shutter speed, it's going to block out the light. So you can see my picture on the very right is getting dark. It's going to be tack sharp, okay, because it's open very so little that it doesn't allow you to get any motion blur. It's great for sports and it's expressed in fractions, high fractions like 1/1000, 1/8000, 1/8000. Once you get into the really slow shutter speeds, it's going to be in whole numbers like 30 seconds, 1 second, 2 seconds. Sometimes it's still a fraction, but it's like 1/4 of a second. They're bigger fractions. So that is the end of this part of the module. That explains what shutter speed is, how it affects the look and feel of the picture, whether you want something with motion blur or whether you want it tack sharp, and how it lets in light and how it keeps out light. So go ahead, if this is not making quite enough sense, go ahead and rewatch it. I hope it is. And in the next module, we will go ahead and look at some focus issues that you might have and how to combat them.